The structures revealed more than just architectural oddities, they contained carvings that resembled a language, intricate patterns that hinted at a sophisticated culture. The scientists were thrilled, but the rest of the colony grew uneasy. If there were natives, why hadn't they shown themselves? And if they did, would they be friend or foe? One day, as Mark and Naomi inspected a newly cleared agricultural field, a shadow fell across them. They turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall and slender, it had an angular face and skin that shimmered in the sunlight. The creature stood silently, its large, reflective eyes taking in the humans. The colonists froze. Mark stepped forward cautiously, his palms raised. "We mean no harm," he said, his voice steady. "We're settlers. We're here to share this world." The alien tilted its head slightly, then raised a thin, long arm. A series of sounds emerged, soft, melodic, almost musical. Naomi stepped closer. "It's trying to communicate." The two groups stood there, separated by only a few meters, each trying to understand the other. The colonists' fears of hostility began to fade, replaced by a cautious curiosity. This was no mindless beast. This was a being that thought, reasoned, and perhaps even hoped to coexist. But as the sun set and the alien vanished into the shadows, one thing became clear: Earth's gravity wasn't the issue here. The real challenge lay in humanity's ability to overcome its own flaws. In the days following the first encounter, the colonists couldn't stop talking about the alien. The shimmering being had sparked equal parts fascination and debate. While some viewed it as a potential ally, others grew uneasy, fearing that any misstep could turn their fragile peace into conflict. Mark called a meeting in the central dome, hoping to set a clear direction. "We need to approach this cautiously," he said, looking around at the gathered settlers. "These beings haven't shown hostility so far, but that doesn't mean they trust us, or that we fully understand them." Naomi chimed in. "The alien was trying to communicate. If we can figure out their language, we might be able to exchange ideas, share knowledge. That could make all the difference." Not everyone was convinced. A few colonists voiced concerns about potential risks. "We don't know anything about them," one man argued. "What if they're hiding something? What if they're just waiting for the right moment to strike?" Mark held up a hand to settle the group. "Paranoia won't help us. Our best chance at survival is cooperation. If we treat these beings with respect and caution, we'll have a better chance of avoiding unnecessary conflict." After the meeting, the settlers formed a small research team led by Naomi. Their goal was simple: observe, record, and learn. They set up an observation post near the area where the alien had appeared, bringing along cameras, recorders, and basic communication equipment. At first, they saw nothing. The alien didn't return, and the landscape remained quiet. But subtle signs began to emerge. Odd patterns appeared in the soil, as if something had moved through during the night. Occasionally, they would find small arrangements of rocks or sticks that didn't seem random. It was as though the aliens were trying to leave messages, if only the humans could understand them. Back at the base, tension simmered. The settlers were adapting to the planet's challenges, but the added stress of a potential alien presence weighed heavily on everyone. Some colonists began grumbling that their leaders were too focused on making friends with the aliens instead of focusing solely on human survival. Mark was aware of the growing discontent. He spoke with Naomi one evening after the day's observations. "I don't know how much longer I can keep everyone on the same page," he admitted. "Some people think we're wasting time. They want me to focus on building defenses instead of studying these beings." Naomi sighed. "I get it. But if we shut the aliens out, if we treat them like enemies before they've done anything to harm us, we'll lose the chance to learn from them. This planet isn't just hard on us, it's hard on them too. They could be the key to making it here long term." Mark nodded, though his expression remained tense. Let's hope we find that key before the colony fractures any further. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly. One morning, a young researcher named Ryan spotted a new set of markings near the observation post. Unlike the previous patterns, these were more intricate, resembling a sequence rather than random symbols. Naomi studied them carefully, comparing them to previous recordings. "I think this might be a form of writing," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. "If we can decode it, we'll have a way to truly communicate." The research team threw themselves into the task, working late into the nights. They pored over the markings, searching for patterns, repeating sequences, anything that might resemble a grammar or vocabulary. Progress was slow. Every small discovery led to more questions, and they knew that even the tiniest misinterpretation could lead to confusion, or worse, offense. Meanwhile, the colony's challenges continued to mount. One of the food shipments from Earth had been lost during transit, leaving the settlers with tighter rations. A piece of critical machinery broke down, and repairing it took days. The high gravity made every task more physically taxing, and tempers began to flare. One particularly heated argument broke out near the central dome. A group of colonists accused the leadership of neglecting their safety, claiming that resources were being squandered on understanding the aliens instead of ensuring survival. "We should be building walls, defenses," one man shouted. "Not wasting time trying to make friends with something we don't even understand." Mark intervened, trying to calm the crowd. "This planet is full of unknowns. The aliens aren't the only challenge we face, but they're not our enemy. If we turn our back on them now, we could miss the opportunity to learn how to live here." A woman stepped forward, her voice tense. "And what if they're just biding their time? What if they're waiting for us to trust them so they can take us down?" Mark met her gaze steadily. "We don't know that. But I do know that building walls won't help us survive. It'll only make us prisoners of our own fear. If we want to thrive, we have to find common ground." The crowd dispersed, but the underlying tension remained. As the weeks passed, the divide between those who supported cooperation and those who advocated isolation grew wider. Mark and Naomi continued their efforts, but they couldn't ignore the growing faction of colonists who believed that humanity's survival depended on shutting the aliens out. One evening, as the research team prepared to decode another set of alien symbols, a commotion erupted near the perimeter. A group of settlers had taken matters into their own hands, constructing makeshift barricades and arming themselves with what little weaponry they had. "If the aliens come back, we'll be ready," one of them said defiantly. Mark confronted them, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't the way. If we show aggression, we risk turning them against us." One of the barricade builders, a tall, wiry man named Paul, crossed his arms. "We're not waiting around to be caught off guard. We're protecting ourselves, something you should have done a long time ago." The situation was growing volatile. Mark knew that if he pushed too hard, the colony could splinter completely. But he also knew that fear-driven decisions could doom them all. "I understand your concerns," he said. "But we need to stay united. If we start working against each other, this planet will break us before the aliens ever could." Paul hesitated, his face hardening. "You think the aliens are our friends? I think you're leading us into disaster." Mark felt the weight of the colony's future pressing down on him. The balance between cautious cooperation and defensive fear was teetering, and any wrong move could send the settlers into chaos. In the days that followed, tensions continued to simmer within the colony. Though Mark managed to talk down the group building makeshift barricades, the division among the settlers was impossible to ignore. There were those who believed in careful diplomacy, led by Mark and Naomi, and those who thought humanity's best chance lay in isolation and fortification. The planet itself wasn't helping matters. The weather seemed to have a mind of its own. Unexpected storms swept through the colony, battering structures and tearing at hastily planted crops. The settlers worked overtime just to keep their infrastructure intact, and the physical strain of labor in the higher gravity left everyone worn down and short-tempered. Even the research team struggled. The symbols left by the aliens became more complex, and while Naomi and her group were certain they were making progress, they had yet to crack the code. Each day without a clear breakthrough felt like another inch closer to failure. Morale, both within the research team and across the entire colony, hit an all-time low. It was during this tense period that the aliens returned. One morning, while Naomi and her team were studying a set of carvings near the observation post, the shimmering alien emerged from the forest. This time, it wasn't alone. Two others accompanied it, their angular forms glinting in the pale sunlight. The research team froze, unsure whether to retreat or stand their ground. Naomi took a cautious step forward. "We don't mean you any harm," she said slowly, repeating the phrase Mark had used during their first encounter. She gestured toward the carvings they'd been studying. "We're trying to understand you." The aliens didn't respond immediately. They exchanged glances, if such a movement could be called glances, and then one of them stepped closer. It reached out a slender hand and, in a deliberate motion, traced a new symbol into the dirt. Naomi watched intently. The pattern it drew wasn't one she recognized from the carvings. Ryan, the young researcher, whispered, "It's teaching us." Naomi nodded. She crouched down and pointed to the symbol, then tapped a recording device and a notebook. "We're recording. We want to learn." The alien drew another symbol, then paused. Naomi glanced at the others. "We need to show them we're trying," she said. With careful movements, she drew a simple line in the dirt, a small, non-threatening shape. The alien tilted its head, then drew a circle beneath the line. A pattern began to emerge. They weren't just leaving random marks, they were building something. A sentence, a thought. Communication. For the first time, Naomi felt a flicker of hope. This was the breakthrough they needed. She made sure the team documented everything, but she kept her voice low and her movements slow. Any sudden gesture might scare them away. Eventually, the aliens stepped back, their shimmering forms blending into the forest as quickly as they'd appeared. The research team stayed behind, stunned and energized. "They're trying to talk to us," Naomi said. "And they're willing to show us how." When the team returned to the central dome that evening, Naomi shared the encounter with Mark. He listened carefully, his face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "If this is the first step toward real communication, it could change everything," he said. "But it also means we have to tread carefully. Not everyone in the colony will see this as good news." Sure enough, when word spread that the aliens had returned, reactions were mixed. Some settlers were encouraged by the progress, but others saw it as a growing threat. "They're getting closer," Paul argued during a heated discussion near the perimeter. "What happens when they decide they've had enough of us poking around their territory? What happens when they bring more of their kind?" Mark addressed the colony the next day, standing on a raised platform in the central dome. "I understand the fear. I do. But we're here to survive, not to start a war we can't win. The aliens haven't shown hostility. They're trying to communicate. If we can understand them, we can avoid conflict altogether." One of Paul's supporters shouted, "Or they're just stalling until they have the upper hand." Mark held up his hands. "We have no evidence to suggest that. What we do have is a chance, maybe our only chance, to share this planet peacefully. I'm asking all of you to trust that working together, with patience and respect, is our best path forward." It wasn't the resounding endorsement Mark had hoped for, but it was enough to keep the peace, for now. The colony returned to its daily struggles, and Naomi's research team continued their work. The symbols they had recorded from the aliens began to make sense, slowly but surely. Simple concepts emerged, words for tree, water, and home. Patterns suggested verbs, actions, and even emotions. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then something unexpected happened. A group of settlers working in a distant field stumbled across another alien structure. Unlike the carvings near the observation post, this one had a distinct shape, an arched doorway carved into a natural rock formation. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for centuries. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols and drawings. The colonists had discovered what appeared to be an alien archive. When the research team arrived, Naomi was speechless. The structure was unlike anything they'd seen before. The drawings depicted what seemed to be a history, alien figures working together, building structures, and thriving. But among these depictions, there were also scenes of conflict. Tall, angular figures stood against smaller, more compact forms. The imagery was crude, but it looked strikingly similar to the humans and the aliens. This could explain why they're so cautious around us, Naomi said quietly. It's possible they've encountered beings like us before. Mark joined her in the archive, his gaze fixed on the walls. And it didn't end well. As the team documented everything, Naomi noticed something else, symbols that matched the patterns the aliens had shown them at the observation post. The carvings here seemed to be a key, an ancient guide to their language. If they could decipher it, they might unlock a deeper understanding of the aliens' culture and intentions. Back at the colony, however, the discovery caused more division. Some settlers viewed it as a treasure trove of knowledge that could lead to harmony. Others saw it as evidence that the aliens had fought off invaders before, and might do so again. This only proves we need to be ready, Paul insisted. They've dealt with intruders before. We're just the latest threat to them. Mark countered, or it shows they've learned the cost of conflict and are looking for another way. As the colony prepared for the weeks ahead, the settlers knew they were approaching a critical moment. The aliens had reached out. The archive offered clues. The groundwork for understanding was there. But with fractures within the colony growing deeper, the question wasn't just whether they could learn the aliens' language, it was whether humanity could overcome its own inner divisions in time. The colony was tense. Every breakthrough in understanding the alien seemed to deepen the divide among the settlers. On one side, Naomi and her team were making slow but steady progress in deciphering the language. On the other, Paul and his followers grew increasingly adamant that humans should fortify their defenses rather than waste time trying to bridge an impossible gap. Mark tried to keep the peace, but every meeting felt like a tug-of-war. He found himself mediating constant arguments, defending the research team's efforts while reassuring those who feared an attack. It was clear that the longer it took to decode the alien language, the more people would lose faith in cooperation. Meanwhile, Naomi and the researchers pored over the symbols and diagrams from the alien archive. With every day, their understanding grew. The symbols weren't just words, they were layered, combining meanings in ways that Earth languages didn't. A single mark could represent both a concept and a feeling, depending on its context. The aliens, it seemed, didn't separate the practical from the emotional in the way humans often did. This isn't just a language, Naomi explained to Mark one evening. It's a worldview. They communicate through connections, between ideas, between people, even between their past and present. They see relationships where we see boundaries. Mark listened carefully, though he wasn't sure how much of this could help in practical terms. Can you actually talk to them yet? He asked. Naomi hesitated. Not fully. But we're close. We've learned enough to recognize greetings, simple questions, and responses. The archive symbols confirm what the aliens have been showing us. I think we'll be able to hold a basic conversation soon. Mark nodded, though his face betrayed his worry. You'll have to show the colony results, and soon. Paul's group is losing patience. I overheard them saying we're putting everyone at risk. Naomi frowned. Mark, if they act out, if they try to provoke the aliens. I won't let it happen, Mark said quickly. I'll keep them in check. Just focus on the language. Not long after, the research team decided to test their understanding. They returned to the observation post, where the aliens had first reached out. Mark accompanied them, both as a show of support and as a safeguard against potential trouble. The settlers watched anxiously as the team set up equipment and prepared to engage with the aliens on a new level. When the aliens appeared, 3 of them, as before, the humans took a slow, careful approach. Naomi stepped forward, holding a small device that projected a simple holographic representation of the symbols they had learned. She began with the basics, a symbol for hello, another for peace. The aliens tilted their heads, the sunlight glinting off their shimmering skin. Then, to everyone's relief, one of them traced a similar symbol in the dirt, a mirror of the human greeting. It was the first genuine exchange. The researchers kept it simple, using only the symbols they were certain of. The aliens responded in kind, repeating the symbols and adding a few new ones. Naomi recorded everything. The entire process felt tentative, like learning to walk on fragile ice, but it was progress. For the first time, they weren't just guessing. They were communicating. When the group returned to the colony, the mood was mixed. Some settlers were excited by the breakthrough, while others remained skeptical. Paul was among the skeptics. So you managed to say hello. Congratulations, he said sarcastically. What happens when you accidentally say something wrong and start a fight? Mark stepped in. Naomi's team is making progress. If we can build trust, we might avoid any conflict altogether. Paul shook his head. You're putting all your faith in the aliens. Meanwhile, we still don't have proper defenses if things go south. You're gambling with our survival. Mark struggled to keep his temper in check. We're not gambling. We're trying to prevent a fight. Building walls won't keep us safe if we don't even know who or what we're up against. Understanding them is our best defense. The tension between the two sides was palpable. Mark and Naomi knew that if they didn't make further progress soon, Paul's faction might take matters into their own hands, and the consequences could be disastrous. Despite the friction within the colony, Naomi's team pressed on. Their growing lexicon allowed for more complex exchanges with the aliens. The next encounter was longer, with the aliens drawing symbols that seemed to describe their home and environment. The researchers reciprocated, carefully choosing symbols that depicted the human settlement and its purpose. Through these halting conversations, Naomi began to piece together a deeper picture. The aliens were not a monolithic culture, they had differences among themselves. They had factions, histories, and past conflicts, just like humans. One alien, who appeared older than the others, often took the lead in these exchanges. It seemed to understand the importance of these early dialogues, though its expressions and gestures were impossible to read in human terms. The most profound moment came when the older alien traced a series of symbols that Naomi eventually interpreted as a question: "Why have you come here?" It was a simple inquiry, yet it carried enormous weight. The humans had to choose their words carefully. Naomi responded with a series of symbols describing Earth, its overpopulation, its environmental struggles, and the human desire to start anew. The alien seemed to consider this, then responded with symbols that suggested both caution and curiosity. It wanted to know more. Back at the colony, Naomi shared these findings with Mark and a few others. "They're not hostile," she said. "But they're wary. They've seen newcomers before, and it hasn't always gone well." Mark looked troubled. "Then we need to show them we're different. That we're willing to learn from them instead of imposing our will." Paul and his faction weren't convinced. They argued that the aliens' caution was a sign of hidden intentions. "They're playing the long game," Paul insisted. "They're watching us, waiting to see if we're weak." But as more settlers listened to Naomi's reports, a shift began to occur. The quiet majority, who had been unsure which side to support, started leaning toward diplomacy. They saw that progress was possible, however slow it might be. The colony's fragile unity held, for now. The next encounter with the aliens brought an unexpected twist. This time, one of the younger aliens approached the humans more closely than before. It seemed curious, examining the humans' equipment and even mimicking some of their gestures. Naomi took a risk and offered a small device, a simple recording tool with holographic displays. The alien accepted it hesitantly, then traced a symbol that seemed to mean, "Thanks, Orc gift." The exchange marked a turning point. The aliens were no longer just tolerating the humans, they were beginning to engage with them. The researchers documented every detail, knowing that each step forward reduced the chance of misunderstanding and conflict. But back at the colony, Paul's group remained on edge. They saw the exchange as a weakness, a potential vulnerability. In their eyes, humanity's survival depended on strength, not trust. And as Naomi's team prepared for another meeting with the aliens, whispers spread among Paul's followers. They were tired of waiting, tired of hoping that cooperation would keep them safe. Unbeknownst to Mark or Naomi, the seeds of rebellion were being sown. While the researchers focused on building a bridge, others were quietly preparing to tear it down. Tensions in the colony had been building for weeks. Despite the growing communication between Naomi's research team and the aliens, a significant portion of the settlers remained unconvinced. Paul's faction grew louder and more organized, claiming that every encounter with the aliens was a step closer to disaster. Mark struggled to maintain order, but the cracks in the colony's unity widened. For Naomi, the progress her team had made was a reason for cautious optimism. She and her colleagues had started to piece together rudimentary exchanges, not only words and ideas, but concepts of time, motion, and shared effort. The aliens had drawn symbols that seemed to indicate understanding of the human struggles with agriculture and construction. Naomi interpreted this as a sign that they might eventually cooperate on more practical levels. But Paul's group didn't see it that way. To them, every interaction was a gamble. They argued that the aliens were only gathering intelligence, learning human weaknesses. They're not here to help, Paul declared during a heated meeting in the Central Dome. They're here to assess whether we're worth the trouble to wipe out. Mark countered calmly, though the strain was visible on his face. There's no evidence of hostility. If anything, they've gone out of their way to avoid conflict. We're the ones who need to prove we're not a threat. Paul scoffed. They're waiting, Mark. They're watching us flail, letting us think we're in control. The moment they decide they've had enough, they'll crush us. Naomi stood and addressed the room. If they wanted to wipe us out, they could have done it already. We have nothing they couldn't take. Instead, they've been open to communication. That's a chance, our only chance, to coexist. Paul turned his sharp gaze on her. And what if you're wrong? What if this so-called communication is just a tactic? Do we just sit and wait to see how they destroy us? Before Naomi could reply, Mark stepped in. We don't know that. But what we do know is that aggression will ensure conflict. We're not equipped for war, Paul. If we provoke them, we're done. The room fell into uneasy silence. Paul didn't respond, but his scowl spoke volumes. He and his followers left the meeting without another word, and Mark knew this wasn't the end of the dispute. The colony was a powder keg, and Paul was holding the match. As Naomi's team prepared for another meeting with the aliens, they worked meticulously to refine their symbols. The aliens had introduced a new series of markings that seemed to indicate shared goals. Naomi's team guessed they were asking what humans needed most. It was an opening for deeper collaboration, one Naomi didn't want to miss. When the aliens appeared at the observation post, Naomi greeted them with careful, deliberate gestures. Using the holographic projector, she displayed a sequence of symbols that outlined the humans' needs, more stable food sources, better materials for shelter, and a greater understanding of the planet's unique environment. The lead alien, the one who seemed older and more deliberate, studied the projection carefully. Then it drew a new sequence, symbols that Naomi interpreted as, "We can help." This was the breakthrough Naomi had hoped for. The aliens were offering assistance, a step beyond simple communication. The team recorded everything, eager to share the news with the colony. But when Naomi and her team returned, the reaction wasn't what she expected. While many settlers were encouraged by the progress, Paul's faction saw it as a dangerous turn. Help? Paul scoffed in a gathering at the central dome. What does that even mean? Their idea of help might be wiping us out and taking what's left. Naomi, exhausted but determined, replied evenly. They've shown no sign of hostility. They want to exchange knowledge, maybe even resources. If we work with them, we could solve some of our biggest challenges. Paul shook his head. Or we could be walking into a trap. We can't keep putting our survival in the hands of these creatures. We need to take control of our own fate. Mark stepped in, trying once again to hold the colony together. Paul, if we ignore this opportunity, we risk failing here altogether. This planet isn't easy on us. If we can find a way to work with the aliens, we'll all be better off. But the rift had grown too wide. That night, whispers spread among Paul's followers. They had decided they couldn't wait any longer. If their leadership wouldn't act to secure humanity's safety, they would. The next morning, Naomi and her team headed to the observation post, eager to continue their dialogue with the aliens. They had planned a simple exchange, basic symbols for trade, cooperation, and shared work. Mark stayed behind, dealing with a new equipment failure that had delayed food production. As the research team set up their equipment, they noticed something was off. The aliens were late. The lead alien eventually appeared, but it moved cautiously, its reflective skin darkened as if in response to stress. Naomi greeted it as usual, projecting the symbols for hello and peace. But the alien did not respond in kind. Instead, it traced a series of rapid symbols that Naomi struggled to understand. One word stood out, danger. Before Naomi could interpret further, a loud crack shattered the still air. A single gunshot. The alien flinched and retreated, disappearing into the trees. Naomi spun around. She and her team hadn't brought weapons. Then she saw them, Paul and a small group of armed settlers standing at the edge of the clearing. One of them held a hunting rifle, its barrel still smoking. They looked tense, but not remorseful. "What are you doing?" Naomi demanded. Her voice was sharp, the shock quickly giving way to anger. Paul stepped forward. "Taking action. You're playing with fire, Naomi. We won't stand by while you put everyone at risk." "You just ruined everything," she said, her voice trembling. "We were building trust, and now..." Paul cut her off. "They weren't going to help us. They were leading us on. We're better off showing them we won't be pushed around." Before Naomi could respond, Mark appeared, having heard the commotion. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Naomi pointed at Paul. "They fired at the aliens." Mark's face darkened. He turned to Paul. "Have you lost your mind? We agreed to handle this carefully." Paul stood his ground. "Carefully doesn't mean waiting for them to strike first. You might not see it, Mark, but they've been sizing us up. This was a warning shot. If they know we're not defenseless, maybe they'll back off." Mark shook his head. "You've just given them a reason to see us as a threat. Do you understand what you've done?" The situation was spiraling. Paul's group retreated to their section of the colony, and Naomi was left to pick up the pieces. Her team tried to contact the aliens again, but the shimmering figures no longer appeared. The trust they had painstakingly built was now shattered, and the colony was more divided than ever. Mark called an emergency meeting that night. "We have to stop this now," he said firmly. "If we let our fears drive us, we'll destroy any chance we had at peace. We'll destroy ourselves." But the colony was no longer united. Lines had been drawn, and the settlers faced a grim reality: their greatest threat wasn't the aliens. It was their inability to trust each other. Tensions in the colony reached a fever pitch after Paul's group openly defied Mark's leadership. The shot fired near the observation post had shattered the fragile trust between the humans and the aliens, and now even the colony's internal unity was unraveling. Mark spent days meeting with the settlers, trying to calm the situation, but the divisions had grown too deep. Naomi's research team continued their work in silence, trying to rebuild the progress they'd made, though their spirits were low. The alien beings didn't return for weeks. Without them, the settlers felt both relief and unease: relief because the immediate fear of retaliation was gone, unease because they knew nothing about the aliens' plans. Rumors circulated that Paul's group was stockpiling supplies and fortifying one of the outer domes. Mark confronted him directly one evening. "What are you doing, Paul?" Mark asked, his voice tired but resolute. "This colony's survival depends on unity. Splitting off and preparing for a fight we don't even know is coming, how does that help anyone?" Paul crossed his arms. "It helps because we can't trust them, your aliens or your so-called diplomacy. If they come back and they're not friendly, we'll be ready. You keep saying we need unity, but you're the one risking everything on some fantasy of peace." "It's not a fantasy," Mark replied. "It's a chance. And if we blow it, we'll never get another." Paul shook his head and walked away. The two men's conversation did little to mend the growing rift, and the colony settled into a tense stalemate. Some settlers remained loyal to Mark's vision of cooperation, while others drifted closer to Paul's more defensive stance. Then, just as suddenly as they had vanished, the aliens returned. Naomi's team had been working in the observation post and the lead alien appeared at the edge of the clearing. This time, it wasn't alone. A larger group of the shimmering figures stood silently among the trees, watching. Naomi froze. The air felt heavy, and she could sense the unease among her colleagues. "No one make any sudden moves," she whispered. The lead alien stepped forward, its shimmering form almost blending into the surrounding light. Naomi carefully displayed the holographic symbols she had prepared. A simple sequence intended to apologize and explain the misunderstanding. The alien studied the projection for what felt like an eternity. Then, to her relief, it traced a response in the dirt. "Conflict, humans dangerous," the symbols read. But beneath that was another line: "Not all humans." Naomi let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. They hadn't completely lost the aliens' trust. She glanced at her team, then cautiously drew symbols of her own. "Not all," she agreed. "Some humans want peace." The alien paused again, then traced a question: "Proof?" "Proof." Naomi realized this was the aliens' way of testing their intentions. They needed something tangible, something that showed the colony was willing to collaborate rather than destroy. Naomi thought quickly. The food crops. The water supply. The settlers had been struggling to adapt to the planet's conditions. The aliens must have noticed. She drew a series of symbols that asked for their guidance on farming and water purification. For the first time, the aliens' posture seemed to shift, as if considering the request. It drew a sequence that Naomi interpreted as, "Show humans." This wasn't a refusal, it was a cautious offer. The aliens were willing to help, but they needed assurance that the humans wouldn't betray that trust again. Naomi returned to the central dome and shared the encounter with Mark. He listened carefully, nodding as she explained. "They're willing to help," she concluded. "But we need to show them we're serious about peace. If we can work together on something practical, something that benefits both sides, we might actually rebuild trust. Mark looked around at the settlers gathered for the meeting. This is our chance, he said. If we work with them, if we show that we're willing to cooperate instead of fighting, we might not only survive here, we might thrive. Some settlers looked hopeful, but others remained wary. Paul, as usual, voiced his skepticism. You're still betting everything on their goodwill, he said. What happens when they turn around and decide they don't need us? We don't have to bet everything, Mark replied. But if we don't take this step, we'll be stuck fighting not just the planet's challenges, but ourselves. That's a fight we won't win. Paul's faction grumbled, but they didn't openly oppose the decision. The colony moved forward with Naomi's plan. In the weeks that followed, the settlers and the aliens began working together in careful, measured steps. The aliens demonstrated techniques for cultivating crops that thrived in the planet's soil. They introduced methods of filtering the planet's unique water sources to make them drinkable without the colony's failing machinery. Each small success built a bridge of trust between the two groups. Paul and his followers didn't interfere directly, but they remained on the sidelines, watching. Mark visited Paul one last time. I know you don't trust them, Mark said. But come and see what they're doing. It's not an invasion. It's cooperation. Paul didn't respond immediately. After a long silence, he said, I'll think about it. That was all Mark could ask for. As the settlers and the aliens continued their collaboration, something remarkable began to happen. The colony grew stronger. The food supply stabilized. Clean water became more abundant. The settlers were less exhausted, less irritable. The divisions within the colony didn't disappear overnight, but the lines blurred. People who had once been staunchly in Paul's camp started to see the benefits of working together. Naomi and the lead alien, the one who had initiated contact, began exchanging more complex ideas. They shared symbols for time, for seasons, for planning. The aliens' own language included concepts of long-term thinking that helped the settlers plan better for the planet's unpredictable weather. In turn, the settlers introduced the aliens to tools and technologies that could make their own lives easier. It was a give and take, a genuine exchange of knowledge. Months passed. The colony, once on the brink of collapse, now stood on firmer ground. Mark looked out over the settlement one evening as the sun set behind the hills. He saw settlers working side by side with the aliens, repairing equipment, tending crops, and learning from each other. It wasn't a perfect peace, old resentments lingered, and misunderstandings still occurred, but it was progress. Naomi joined him, wiping dirt from her hands after a long day in the fields. We still have a long way to go, she said. Mark nodded. We do. But for the first time, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. The aliens had shown humanity a path forward, one built not on dominance, but on collaboration. And while Earth's gravity had once been the colony's biggest challenge, it was the weight of their own choices that had ultimately determined their survival. In working together, both humans and aliens had taken a step toward something neither could achieve alone.